Many of you know me as a longtime Peninsula resident and Pebble Beach Company historian. I still work full-time for Pebble Beach Company, remotely from Florida for the most part. They were kind enough to let me go help with my parents who were aging and weren't going to leave Florida. So we're there for I don't know how long. I get back occasionally, and it was wonderful on this visit to be able to see the new Dali exhibit and talk to you a little bit about Dali's time, which was mostly at Pebble Beach resorts. He actually lived and worked at the resorts. There's lots of misnomers, and we'll get through some of that history here. Some of you may even remember back in 2000, we did, with Monterey History and Art Association, a Dali party redo. And my wife, Bettina, was the chairman of that. So we had an earlier relationship with Dali, and that was actually held at the Hotel Del Monte, and well attended with lots of costumes. So they're going to do another Dali party here in the Monterey Peninsula at the end of October. So stay tuned for more information on it. And that will be, I guess, a fundraiser for the Monterey Zoo. So you'll get more information on that. Well, let's talk about Dali on the peninsula, because that's why we're here, and we'll see if we can get all the technology to work. Some of you know me to be a little more animated and walking around. They're filming this, so hold all your questions to the end. We'll get through this as quick as we can. I put this chart together because a lot of people, when they think of Dali on the Monterey Peninsula, they think he held a party at the Hotel Del Monte and that was it. He was here a lot. The party was on this first visit in August, September of 1941, which was a relatively brief visit. He came over in 1940, first arriving in New York in August of 1940, and then quickly making his way down to Virginia. He was a refugee of the World War II. He had actually been arrested by the Franco forces in July, so as soon as he got out, and he came here. Some sources say Picasso paid his way. I'm not sure why he would have had to, because Dali was already very well known. It was the year before that he threw the bathtub out of the window of the Bonwit Teller because he didn't like what they did to his display in the window. So he was already a character known in the United States, but he came here. The interesting thing is when he went down to Virginia in September, he stayed at a plantation home of a patron of the arts, Mrs. Carice Crosby. No relationship to Bing that I know of. But he went there primarily to write. Here's an artist. He wants to go and write his autobiography. He's not even that old. But he's writing his autobiography there in Virginia, and ironically, I guess ironic is the right word, there was another refugee of the war staying at the home by the name of Henry Miller. Henry Miller was, of course, a writer, but he went there to paint. And I'm not sure, the reports are they didn't get along very well. I think there was a clash of egos, if you will. But it's kind of interesting that they both ended up here on the Monterey Peninsula in the 1940s. So, and making their home here. Miller more down in Big Sur. So anyway, here's kind of a quick graph that I put together so you can see that it really was a lot more than just a party. And you'll see more of that as we go. He also saw this time of refuge as a transition. He said, until recently, my paintings have all been psychopathological. Now I am entering a new phase, combining the mythology of the individual with the aesthetic tradition. Wow, okay. Now, we think that's what he said. Dali at the time at least said he didn't speak any English. Mostly French. What he understood, nobody's sure. I heard it described one time, even when he learned English, he'd go through a sentence and you'd hear English, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and you could maybe hear every fourth word. So anyway, it really, although you think of surrealism as surrealism, when you know that he was starting to really work in mythology and you look at his work, you'll see some of that. But let's set the stage, because most of his biographers are either from the East Coast or Europe, and they really don't understand the Monterey Peninsula. So you have him staying at Del Monte Lodge, Del Monte Hotel, Pebble Beach. Where did he stay? Well, this was kind of the lay of the land. Here's Hotel Del Monte, center stage. It was kind of the focus of life, certainly the resort life at the time. The company was called Del Monte Properties Company, and everything was known as Del Monte for the most part, and that's part of the confusion. But Hotel Del Monte is where he came originally, and later he stayed at the lodge at Pebble Beach or Del Monte Lodge. So Del Monte Lodge, Del Monte Hotel. If you're not from here, it's confusing, but we'll get that clarified for you. This is what Hotel Del Monte looked like in 41, 42 when Dali stayed here. I don't know what rooms he occupied, but he and Gala took a suite where they could entertain writers who came in and had questions and whatnot, and another room where he actually did his paintings at the hotel. And the first visit, as you saw, was relatively short, but he still did paintings at Hotel Del Monte in 41. The lodge looked more like this when they were there. It hadn't been very well developed. It was primarily an annex to the hotel. Most people who came here stayed at the hotel. I'm going to show you this other picture. This is after the build-out in the early 60s. Most of the build-out happened right after World War II. So let me introduce you to a couple of the local characters that are part of the story. This is Samuel F.B. Morse. He ran Del Monte from 1915 until 1969 when he died. The first few years as a manager, the last 50 as the owner of the property. So he was very key, and he had to deal with all of the shenanigans the Dalis would do when they were here on the property. And this is Julian Graham. Some people remember him as Spike. He was the company photographer from 1924 to 1963, and he's responsible for many of the photographs that we'll see today, including those that you saw in the lobby that were all taken in 1941, most of them at the party, and one of them with some of his art that we'll talk about. Dali was really taken by the peninsula and its scenery. He loved the beauty. He said it reminded him of his home in Cadaqués. This was in Spain. Cadaqués is really in the very northeast corner of Spain, almost to France. So even though he was Spanish by birth, his preferred language was French, or some surrealistic version of it that you could almost make up. He actually grew up in Figueres, a little bit inland from the coast, but he had, in his later years, he had a home in Cadaqués as well. So this place reminded him of home, and he loved the almost surrealistic flora that we had here. Here's a picture of the witch tree. This is another picture. There is a picture, it's not in our collection, but this big boulder on the side, there's a picture of Dali sitting on it sketching this tree. And this is Dali and Gala enjoying life at Del Monte. This, I believe, is sitting around the pool. The gentleman in the back is, I believe, Irie Pincard. Irie was the professional host at Hotel Del Monte and conveniently spoke French. So he attended a lot of the parties that the Dalis attended in 1941, and I think that's Irie. There's a slight possibility it could be Herb Serwin, but I think it's Irie. Herb Serwin is another character. There's Herb over on the right. Herb was the publicity man for the hotel from 1933 to 1942. And as Sam Moore said, he would do anything for publicity. And he created a lot of publicity at Hotel Del Monte. He was good friends with all the newsreel people. And with Dali in town, he created a Butte, the party that you see illustrated outside, as well as here. People were encouraged to dress as their worst dream. This is definitely Irie Picard over here as the Centurion Hitler, dancing with his wife. The photograph in the middle, there's a version of out in the hallway, but this gives you an idea of the main party. The roof was lined with these burlap bags stuffed with paper to create kind of a grotto effect, and this large main table was the bed. And Gala was here at the head of the bed, nursing a young lion. The masks put on mannequins. Here you've got Bob Hope and Jackie Coogan. Some of you may go back to remember Jackie Coogan as a childhood actor. Some of you, like me, probably remember him better as Uncle Fester from the Addams Family television show. But he was there. He was actually posted in the army at the Presidio at the time of the party. So he came in. Down here is Sam Morse with his wife Relda. And this is a model lying by a wrecked car as if she'd been in an accident. And she was totally nude and drugged so that she would just sleep through the party. And an interesting note, in the middle of this table filled with people, this cage has a live porcupine in it. They brought a lot of animals down from the Flashacker Zoo. Flashacker was one of the board members of Pebble Beach Company, or Del Monte Properties Company at the time. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about the party because it really was a small part and we only got a little bit of time, but I do have to give you a little bit of a setup. These are also pictures that weren't in the Pebble Beach collection, but they are Graham photographs. I got these from Barbara Briggs Anderson, who is the wife of the grandson of Julian Graham. And she knew I knew Bruce Arras and said, oh, well, you should see these photographs. This is Bruce, who helped interpret Dali's dream for the surrealist party. And that's Bruce putting the burlap bags up on top of the ceiling in the Bali room, stuffing them around all of the rafters. And Dali and Bruce Arras had a few interactions together, and we'll see more of Bruce as we go through. This is what Bruce looked like a little bit later, and some of you probably know him even later than that. But let's get into the pictures of Dali and his art. This is a picture you might have seen in the lobby. This is one of the first pictures that Graham took of Dali at Hotel Del Monte with some of his art. Anybody know what that art is? No. There it is, as it looks today, sort of. This is art that he did in his study for The Labyrinth, which was a ballet that he did the scenes, the costumes, and the libretto for. And it was performed in New York and a few other cities. So here are the paintings with Dali. There's paintings that are in collections. It's interesting to note a few differences. In this painting, look at the branch here, has no leaves. Here it does. This was actually a screen where the actors walked through. This was a study for the big screen. And this was kind of his Venus de Milo look for The Labyrinth. It was an interesting ballet from all reports, ran about 7 minutes, and didn't get the raves that he got for his earlier ballet, Bacchanal, but it was appreciated. But this was one of the studies. He left. He was here for about 2 months and then left right after the party. He was not happy with the way the party went. He didn't get the giraffe that he asked for from the Flashacker Zoo. And the cost of the party was more than the revenue from the party, so there was no money raised for the refugee artists as was planned. So he literally left. The party was on September 2nd, and in September 7th, he was down in Los Angeles for an art exhibition there. This was the story in the Los Angeles Times on September 6th, where he was with one of his paintings there. I love the quote, "The two luckiest things that can happen to a contemporary painter are first to be Spanish and second to be named Dali, and both have happened to me." He left right after that and went to New York for the ballet. He had to get the Ballet Russe ready to go. It opened in New York on October 8th. It was a play based on the Greek mythology. Again, if you want to understand Dali, you better know Greek mythology, especially during this period. The Minotaur was kind of the foil for all evil in the world today, especially the war and the things that were going on around the war. And Theseus, the hero, was trying to solve the problems, find the cord, and save everything. It did okay. It opened in New York in October. January, it was in Los Angeles. I'm sorry, January it was in San Francisco, and February it was in Los Angeles. After a brief time in New York, he came back to Los Angeles. You can see the top news account. He flew into Los Angeles in November of '41 and spent most of the winter and spring in California, but not here. They've got him in Los Angeles, Palm Springs, the Palace Hotel in San Francisco when they did Labyrinth, and Santa Maria Inn, and Burlingame with Mrs. Andrew McCarthy. So he traveled around quite a bit. Mrs. Andrew McCarthy was tied to the Dali retrospective at the Palace of Legion of Honor. Mrs. Andrew McCarthy was better known as Dorothy Spreckles Dupuy McCarthy. She was the daughter of Alma and Claus Spreckles, the Sugar King. Alma was responsible for building the Palace of Legion of Honor, primarily for her Rodin collection. But in May of '42, they had a Dali retrospective. And one of the paintings that he did that winter up in Burlingame with Ms. McCarthy was a portrait of Dorothy. And this is her portrait of Dorothy. By the time the painting was done, she was separated from Mr. McCarthy. It's hard to know what might have gone on. There's an awful lot of leg in this painting. But the painting stayed with Dorothy for most of her life, and now it's in the permanent collection at the Legion of Honor in San Francisco. It was kind of the beginning of a portrait period for Dali. He did a lot of portraits. Now, even though he was here in California, it's interesting to note that this ad from the New York Times shows that he had worked with S. Farrak, who was the same guy who was producing the ballet in New York, to design this decor for a Spanish festival in New York. And another newspaper account in May of '42 said that he would be working on Romeo and Juliet, another ballet. And he, in fact, did work on Romeo and Juliet. He arrived back at Hotel Del Monte in August of '42 and worked on Romeo and Juliet. These are from his sketchbooks. These are photographs Graham took of his sketches for the sets of the ballet Romeo and Juliet. Here's another sketch of one of the sets. And here's some of the costumes that he designed for the ballet. It would have been a wonderful ballet, but it never happened. He did all this work for naught. This is an interesting piece from the series that Graham shot with Romeo and Juliet art, and it actually appears in one of the big books on Dali's paintings. This is the most interesting in the series. This was all part of the photography series that Graham did of the Romeo and Juliet, but I can't find this art matching anything that Dali ever did. The lips here look a lot like some jewelry he designed later, but I'm not sure if those are lips or limbs. If you notice, that's really a leg coming up there. Interesting characters, but this is the most interesting, rare piece of Dali art that I've come across in the collection. More portraits. He continued to paint portraits in '42. This is actually Helena Rubinstein. Helena took the princess title after marrying a rather dubious Russian prince in 1938, and he painted this portrait of Princess Archil Goreli, and also did other work for Helena over the years. He painted Ambassador Cardenas, who was the Spanish ambassador to the United States during the era. So this was kind of a tie to home for him to paint this one. This is kind of an interesting piece. Mrs. Harrison Williams was on all of the best dressed lists, and he was doing a portrait of her. And it's interesting that the Chronicle kind of speculated, well, if he put Dorothy Spreckles on a dolphin, maybe he'll put Mrs. Williams on a clothes horse. But also indicated that he would finish this in New York. He came back to Del Monte in December of '42, so he was not in New York very long. And he was here when his book, his autobiography, was finally published. Hakoun Chevalier was the UC Berkeley professor that helped get it translated. He met Hakoun on his first visit to California back in 1941. But you can see the soft self-portrait, as it's called, on the left on the inside pages of the book, and the portrait of Gala. And I kind of think that she might have been the inspiration for Elsa Lancaster in The Bride of Frankenstein. But it is kind of an interesting art. This was a book that was mixed reviews, well worth the read. There's a paperback version of it here at the store. You get a real sense of Dali's sense of himself. It begins before he was born, so he's giving you a lot of information, and And it comes after his meeting with Freud, who died just before the book was published. So I'm not sure how Freud would have taken it. He never got a chance to read it. So while he was at the hotel in December of 42, by New Year's Eve 1942, he was at the lodge, staying at Cottage Row. The reason, because in January of 1943, the Navy took over Hotel Del Monte on a long-term lease for the duration of the war. And that was no longer rooms available for guests. That was rooms available for Navy cadets who were getting ready to go off to the Pacific. One of the paintings he did in this period is Geopolitical Child Watching the Birth of Man. Now it's interesting because this is a 1943 painting. This is a 1942 photograph. Now, if you really look, though, you do see differences. Look back in here. This is not the same. You've got some little differences here. You've got some differences back in here. So it probably is a painting that he finished in 1943, but it really is intriguing, envisioning the world after the war, which was a big theme for him. He wanted the war to be over, and he was looking forward to that happening. Now, there was a writer here on the peninsula at the time by the name of Robert Hunter. Robert was a socialist. He taught at Berkeley in the early days. He had actually been a gubernatorial candidate in Connecticut back in 1910. But he wrote a book in 1940 called Revolution, How, Why, and When. He lived in Pebble Beach, dabbled in golf course architecture. You may know him from his golf course architecture because he worked with Alistair McKinsey to build Cypress Point, helped get Pebble Beach ready for the 1929 U.S. Amateur. But he really was a writer and a socialist at that. But in this book, Revolution, one of the things he wrote is, it's possible when the period of strains and stresses is past, we shall find that like the pangs of childbirth, they were the necessary painful prelude to the creation of a new and better social order. And that may have been something that Dali came across in his time here on the peninsula, because everybody here would have known Robert Hunter, and even Dali might have met Hunter at the time. Hunter died in 1944, so he was actually down in Montecito at the time. So the work that he did in 42 went back to New York in April of 43, mostly his portraits. The Knoedler Gallery put together a display of his portraiture. It was not well received. The art critics thought it was really bad. But you can see that Dorothy Spreckles was among them, Mrs. Williams was among them, and a few other portraits that he had done along the way. It was an experiment. From New York, instead of coming back to California, they actually drove up to Franconia, New Hampshire. They stayed at the home of Marquis de Cuvier, who was one of the ballet impresarios that Dali had befriended along the way. And there he worked on his book. He had a new book that he wanted to write. And it was there in New Hampshire that he wrote this book called Visages Cachés. And Hakoun Chevalier joined him in September of 1943 to turn this dubious French manuscript into an English book called Hidden Faces. Anybody here read Hidden Faces? A few. It's a wonderful read. It's surrealistic fiction, but it is kind of his view, and I'll talk to you a little bit about it. The interesting thing about it is this 400-page French manuscript somehow ended up in the archive at Pebble Beach Company. We have it, and it has Dali's sketches that I suspect were done to help Hakoun understand what he was saying in his rather broken French. So you can see there were lots of little edits and drawings throughout this. But the book was really an interesting find, but even more interesting than that were these 3 pages in Dali's own hand that were with it. Anybody speak French? Anybody can translate this? It is not easy to translate. Excuse me. But it is interesting. We actually worked at it. I had a French-Canadian working in the golf office at the time, so I had her take a look at it. She couldn't figure it out. We worked at a lot of different things. We're looking at some of these things like Lobster telephone, we can kind of figure that one out, but aphrodisiac jockey, what the heck is an aphrodisiac jockey? It was a small joke that's kind of sexy, or what is it? But it's the way he wrote. We translated it, and this is kind of the beginning. It says, hidden faces after the sensational soft watches, lobster telephones, aphrodisiac jackets, and edible Napoleons of the secret life dream Dalian. Salvador Dali, and I haven't been able to figure out what this is up here, but something about him having written his first epic novel. This first great novel existing for the tragedy of the post-war period, the passion of absolute love of 6 protagonists through the most romantic and intense 12 years in contemporary history, after which develops a consistent story of some kind or another and rigorously tangled. And that's just this portion of it. That was his promotion of this book, Hidden Faces. I don't know if it was ever used by anybody. But it was fascinating to find this. So I actually went out and bought the book and read it, and it's very good. He was back at the lodge before the book came out, and the newspaper said he was back for his customary few months in January of 44. 44 was not a customary few months. This was a much longer stay. One of his longest stays was in 1944. And he was greeted when he got back by a fan letter. Now, these letters come out of a catalog that was done for the Dali and Disney exhibit that was done in St. Petersburg last year. And here you can see the letter from Walt Disney to Salvador Dali at Del Monte Hotel. So even Walt was confused. He was at the lodge by then, not the hotel. And the response from Dali on the Del Monte Lodge letterhead. So he had come across the secret life of Salvador Dali, and he wanted his signature in the book. And he kind of hinted at maybe a project a little bit later together, a collaboration. Well, Dali made a few trips down to Los Angeles, but not to work with Disney. He started work on a portrait of Anne Warner, the wife of Jack Warner, the producer. And he started it down there, but finished it at Del Monte, and then went back to Los Angeles to deliver it to Jack Warner on his birthday. And at the party, Hedda Hopper says, when I saw Salvador Dali's painting of Anne Warner, I knew he was destined for a screen offer. It came that night. Alfred Hitchcock was at the party, very impressed with the painting, and said, I want you to do the dream sequence for this movie I'm working on, The House of Dr. Edwards, which became Spellbound. And Dali actually started working on the sets that fall. And if you haven't seen Spellbound, there was a much longer dream sequence that was cut down, but he actually did do this dream sequence in Spellbound with his art. It was also during 44 that he really started getting into working with master's touch. This is his portrait of Gala. He said it took him 540 hours to complete this. He was really trying to understand how the masters worked and how they brought light and color into the painting. So he really worked this one a lot that year. Now this is one of my favorite pictures. This is Dali at the easel. I have no idea who the woman is, and it's kind of hard to see exactly what's on the easel, but if we detail it in a little bit, we start to see there's a couple of tigers taking shape on that easel. And that one of them looks an awful lot like the tiger in this newspaper print over to the side. So you get a sense from this that Dali wasn't just pulling things out of his head. He was using other resources to help illuminate his visions for his art. And these tigers actually ended up showing up in one of his longer named paintings, 1 second before awakening from a dream caused by a flight from a bee around a pomegranate. You know, you could read a lot into this painting. When I first saw it, I didn't notice the fish eating the tiger on the left. And in the back, you'll see the space elephant. You may have seen a sculpting of the space elephant in the display, a three-dimensional version of that space elephant. This, is, I believe, is the first painting where the space elephant shows up. It became a regular feature in a lot of Dali's paintings. I love this painting. And I love the juxtaposition with him at the easel with the painting just being started. So it's kind of fun. This was a photograph of Dali that I never fully understood. And then I found the story. In 1944, in the summer of 44, there was a robbery at the lodge at Pebble Beach. They got away with a few $1,000s, and they made their getaway in a stolen car, the Dali's 1941 Cadillac. The Cadillac was recovered about a month later. The guy was caught. The money was not recovered. But Dali got his car back, and I think he's here on the net saying, "You tried to get away, but we caught you." The car was actually very important to them. It was a 1941 Cadillac Series 62 convertible, and when they finished their time in America, they took it back with them to Spain, and it is in the museum, or at the museum at Figueres. And if you look at this picture that shows the Cadillac in Figueres, you may notice a torso over there, which is the actual scrim from Labyrinth that we saw the study for that he did here at Del Monte. And then after months of work in September of 1944, he was ready to go to New York again with his art. And he said, but I'm always going to paint on the Monterey Peninsula because it reminds him so much of his native Spain and because here people don't disturb him. So he liked Monterey. That was a good thing. His time in New York was brief, but while he was there, he did these large scrims for a show called Seven Lively Arts at the Billy Rose Ziegfeld Theater. It was a star-studded performance. Unfortunately, all we have of these are the photographs. These were destroyed in a fire at the theater. So, but he did art for each of the arts, if you will. And then he came back. In February 45, he was back at the lodge and resumed communication with Disney. Here you can see another one of his letters on Del Monte Lodge stationery. Wanted to talk more about that concept of doing a project together. He got another letter that early visit. In February 45, he got a letter from Samuel Morse. Seems that Gala was a little bit feisty and not happy with the way things were going and a bit demanding. Perhaps the lodge was not quite like the St. Regis in New York. And Sam Morse had to send her a nice letter saying, I understand it's difficult, but this is a time of war. Things aren't as easy as they were. We need you to come along and play the game with us. You can say there at the end. He apparently handled it politically correct enough that they stayed. They didn't leave in a huff. They stayed and continued to make the place their home. Another story that I just heard that took place in 45 was with Mr. and Mrs. Burgess Meredith. You may know Burgess's wife at the time was really Paulette Goddard. And they were up here in 1945. Burgess had become good friends with John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts shortly after doing Of Mice and Men in 1938. And they were up here in 45. John wasn't here. John was down in Mexico filming The Pearl, but Ed was here. And Burgess met Dali, and he says, I'd really like to do a surrealistic movie with you. So he asked Ed to scout some spots down in the South County where they could film a surrealistic movie. Now, I don't know what Ed had in mind. When I think of surrealism in South County, I think of Pinnacles. There's some really surrealistic sites there. But whatever he had in mind, Dali and Paulette and Burgess piled into Ed Ricketts' car and they headed down to South County and they roamed looking for sites. And they roamed to the point that by the time it was dark, they were hopelessly lost. And they finally came across a little schoolhouse and there was a light in the house next door. So they went and knocked on the door, and can you imagine the young school teacher opening the door and finding Burgess Meredith, Paulette Goddard, and Salvador Dali standing on her doorstep? So anyway, that's a story Burgess told on tapes that are at the Steinbeck Center. The teacher's recall is also on the tapes, and I thank my friend Robbie for that because she's listened to a lot more tapes over there than I have. So thank you, Robbie, for that. Another interesting story about Burgess and Paulette is shortly before Dali went back to Spain, he was at their house for dinner, and Paulette decided she was going to serve pork. It happened to be Burgess's pet pig. You can see they were married from 1944 to 49. They were separated shortly after the pork dinner. Dali was here when the atomic blasts over Hiroshima were hit. And he said it shook me seismically, the atomic explosion. He says, thenceforth the atom was my favorite food for thought. So some people say this became his atomic period. One of his important paintings that he did during that period was Uranium and Atomica Melancholia Idol. I couldn't begin to tell you everything I know about this painting, but it's kind of an interesting piece that was really based on that. One of the things, you'll see the space elephants again up at the top. Down here is baseball. Now, I don't know Dali to be a baseball fan, and I wonder if this baseball theme, most people speculate it was to show that even though there was a war going on, they were still playing baseball. But I also think that perhaps that baseball might have gotten into his mind after getting the letter from Sam Morse to play the game. He probably needed that phrase explained to him, and somebody kind of explained it with a baseball theme, and baseball started working into some of his work, especially during this era. So after spending most of the year at Del Monte, Dali has 10 canvases ready to take to New York. He was pretty prolific in his time here. And they went to the Bignell Gallery of Paintings. Some of the other paintings he did that year were Basket of Bread, again, working on that old master style. And another one of his long painting names, My Wife Nude, Contemplating Her Own Flesh Becoming Stairs, 3 vertebrae of a column, sky, and architecture. And it's all there, but it's kind of intriguing what he had in mind with that painting. You can contemplate on that yourself for a while. I'm sure Gala contemplated on it quite a bit. Another one from that period was the Apotheosis of Homer. I won't begin to try to explain this one, but I would encourage you, if you want to learn it, be sure you're up on your Greek mythology, because there's a lot of Greek mythology in this painting. And another one, Napoleon's nose transformed into a pregnant woman walking his shadow with melancholia. Melancholia seemed to be a theme of the 40s, and maybe that was part of the whole atomic war thing. The atomic era was big. And thankfully I'm a historian, not an art critic, so I can't tell you what it means. But they went to the exhibit. This was the cover of the exhibition in 45. You'll note the play on his secret life of Dali being The Secret of Dali, and the secret is Gala. Gala was what made him a success. Kind of an interesting. Ants, another popular feature in many of his paintings. But he came back to California in January of 45, but not to Monterey. He went to Los Angeles because he had worked things out with Disney to begin collaboration on Destino. Anybody seen Destino? They show it here occasionally. It's a short animation that Dali worked on in 45. They never finished it in his lifetime. They finished it in 2000. They found the storyboards in storage and hired a French director to help convert the story into animation. Here you can see kind of a ball that becomes the head as these two faces come together. You'll note the mustache on this face looks a little bit like Dali. I suspect this might have been Dali and Disney coming together as Destiny, although you'll note that Disney had a mustache too, but if you put a mustache like that on a face like this in 1945, people might have confused it with Hitler, so no mustache on the other one, but I still think it's Disney and Dali coming together. Interesting piece, worth watching. He didn't stay working on it in the studios in Burbank. He came back to the lodge and he began working on other projects. Now, one of the sources for a lot of my information, because it's not covered in many biographies, is What's Doing magazine, which was a publication by Bruce Aris, who I mentioned earlier. And Dali works in his Del Monte apartment from 9 a.m. to 1 a.m. is what What's Doing reported in July. But Bruce also did the covers for these magazines. They were woodblock prints. And here you can see that Dali was not the only one influenced by the atomic era. This would have been a piece that would have been done in 1946 by Bruce for the January 1947, where you have this atomic-themed cover. Happy Atomic Year 3 is how it's titled. But one of his letters to Disney in 46 was, "This month I'm going to start work on my new painting, Leda. But destino will not leave my imagination. I will write down my ideas." Now this is Leda, which was finished in 1949, but he actually did begin working on it in 46 in the midst of doing Destino. And this is part of his atomic period. If you notice, Leda is not sitting on this. She's floating. Nothing is touching. Like in Atoms, nothing touch. And I think that whole science thing had him going. The goose doesn't touch Leda. Leda doesn't touch the bench. The feet aren't on the pedestals. Nothing touches. So the 1947 study of it was done at the Lodge and shown in New York at his next big show in 1947. But the painting wasn't finished until 1949. Also in 1946, he started illustrating books. 3 books came out the end of that year with his illustrations: Macbeth, the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, and Don Quixote de la Mancha. All previously published books, but new versions with his art. But where he spent that winter in 46, 47 remains a bit of a mystery. I found some clues. This Los Angeles Times piece from September of 46 shows that he was working on a painting of Mrs. Paul Colesman, Colesman, and suggested that there is a dolphin on the canvas, and there is said to be more of the dolphin than there is of Lali, as she was known, and was arranged also for her dogs, of which she had a houseful to be squeezed in along with the painting. So he was working on a painting in Los Angeles, apparently. And also in September, some canvases that he did, actually a canvas that Dali did, along with several other artists, were on display at the Knoedler Gallery in New York. These were all done as a competition of St. Anthony's Temptation for a movie called Bellamy that was being produced, and Dali lost. So I doubt that he went to New York for the exhibition, even though his art was there. And then 3 new Dali paintings interpret perfume in October of 46. At an opening, the paintings were at an opening at the Knoedler Gallery in New York. Big event, but no mention of Dali being there, so I don't know that he went to New York at all that year. Now, here is the painting of Lali, and you'll note that she's really Luli Colesman, K-O-L, not C-O-L-E. I don't see any dolphin, so he apparently reworked it from the description in the paper. But this is Luli. Her husband was a noted engineer, most noted for having created the altimeter for airplanes, but he did a lot of work in the military design, and they had a big home in Beverly Hills, big up on the hill, 1920s mansion. So I'm suspecting he might have just spent most of the winter there with the Colesmans. This was his interpretation of St. Anthony's, the Temptation of St. Anthony. And again, you can see the space elephants showing up. I'm not sure how that fits into St. Anthony's Temptation, but that was his version of it. And he lost to Max Ernst, and this was Max Ernst's version that ended up in the movie Bellamy. And then this is his trilogy of the desert. The 3 small paintings are here on the left, and then you can see a 2-page spread magazine article using his Invisible Lovers painting for advertising the desert flower perfume. So those were some of the things he was working on that winter. But then in April of 47, he is back, and declares him a regular customer now. So he's back at the Lodge and active in the community. This is a picture from What's Doing magazine that shows him actually judging an art competition in Carmel. And with him is Phil Nesbitt, who did the monkey shines in what became the tap room, but used to be the monkey shines room, so he was that. Armin Hansen. And if you walked around the gallery and saw the big printing press, that was Armin Hansen's printing press up there. and Myron Oliver was actually one of the judges as well as Maxine Albro, who is in the picture. This appears to have been a statewide high school art competition in Carmel held for the 20th anniversary of the Carmel Art Association. And Dali was one of the judges. How impressive is that to win? Here we've got some of Graham's photos of Dali working in his studio. Here he's working on the dematerialization near the nose of Nero. Again, atomic theme, nothing is touching. The dematerialization, I'm not sure where it comes in, but the atoms are probably breaking down the statue. But it's interesting to see how he worked with his straight edge along the side of the easel to work with. And he even made the cover of one of Bruce's magazines. This is Bruce's tribute to Salvador Dali with the melting watch, or the soft watch as he called it in his piece. Some of you who knew Bruce in his later years would remember him looking more like this. He was a good friend in his time. But this is the article that showed up in that 1947 picture. It's kind of interesting to look at and read. You can see that on the easel there's a painting. Well, there's the painting. It's St. George and the Dragon. The dimensions are unknown, but we could probably guess at it from this piece. It also indicates that he, in addition to working at the Lodge in 1947, maintained a studio at the home of Colonel Mack. Colonel Mack had a big home not too far from here, kind of between the airport and Del Monte Golf Course. This is Dali outside. Now in this picture you can see the hand in the back. Here you can see him holding that hand. It's one of the things he used to help him with dimensionality. But this is outside at the studio at Colonel Mack's, and you may recognize this as what's now Santa Catalina School. So that's where he did some of his work. And here's that hand again showing up in one of his paintings, the atomic equilibrium of a swan feather. Again, there's so much you could read into his paintings. This is another one of his 1947, the Three Sphinxes of Bikini, and if that's not atomic, what is? This one, appropriately, is now in Japan. Here we go. Here's his portrait of Pablo Picasso in the 21st century. I'm not sure exactly what he was saying here. They actually were pretty good friends, and Pablo didn't look nearly that bad in 1947. But he was envisioning him in the 21st century, so I don't know what he envisioned for the 21st century, but compared to his own self-portrait, it's not that bad. And this is another interesting piece. Here's Dali working on an easel, and here we know who the young lady is. And the newspaper account of this beginning in 1947 was that it might take years to finish because Dali couldn't decide how to paint Mitzi Siegel, whether profile or full face. And Mitzi was a debutante from the year before, so she was a moneyed young lady from San Francisco who was staying at hotel at the, I'm not even sure she was at the hotel. She might have rented a home with her mother for the summer, and they were down here and decided to hire Dali to do her portrait. What a lucky young lady. Well, he went back in 1947 to New York for another show. And it's interesting to note that in this gallery book from 1947 to 48 is where this 1944 painting with the tigers shows up. So even though it's called New Paintings by Salvador Dali, it didn't show up in a gallery until 47, even though it was done in 44. This is actually being offered right now. If you want to buy this catalog, you can buy the catalog for $1,200. And then the word was he was coming back to the lodge in March of 48, but he was anxious to get home. The war was over, and he was thinking it's time to go back and see my father in Spain. He did finish up a couple of paintings. Here is the final painting of Mitzi Siegel that didn't take 3 years. It only took a year. He finished it in 1948, and it may have been the last painting that he did on the Monterey Peninsula. Or it might have been this portrait of Enid Haldorn, which was also done in 1948. Enid was also a debutante, but a few years earlier. Enid had been a debutante back in 1908 in San Francisco. She was the daughter of Wellington Gregg, who was one of the first board members of Del Monte Properties Company when Sam Morse founded it. And she married Stuart Haldorn. If you don't know the name Stuart Haldorn, Stuart was a big yachtsman, and this Haldorn Regatta at Stillwater Cove opens the yachting season at Pebble Beach every year. But just before this painting, they lived in this little house along the coast. This isn't a really good picture of it, but this is approximately where the Monterey Plaza Hotel is today, and it's best known as the Tevis Murray Mansion. Haldorn was Murray's stepson and inherited the house and millions of dollars when his mother died. So they were well off. Sold this just before 1942, finally gave way to the canneries. Lived at the Hotel Del Monte for a while. They were planning to make their home there, but when the Navy took over the hotel, like Dali, they moved to Pebble Beach, but they moved to a home in Pebble Beach and lived there for the rest of their life. This painting is now part of the permanent collection at the de Young Museum in San Francisco. And that's kind of a look at Dali and his time and how significant it was beyond just throwing a little party in 1941. So hopefully you've enjoyed seeing some of the work that he did here. This is not all of the work he did here. He did 10 to 15 paintings a year in the time that he was here. And you can see many of them in the catalogs. One of my sources was the Salvador Dali catalog that was put together by the Spanish Dali Museum and is available online, and you can see all of his paintings, get sizes, locations to what they know. So there's a number of good sources where you can see Dali's greater work, including now here at this museum. And I did notice that in their posters out here, they have two of his paintings that were in this show. The Moment Before Waking with the Tigers is one of the posters they have out there, as well as the birth pangs coming out of the egg. So anyway, with that, I will close unless you've got some questions.